I think that's a good bridge to political trust, which we're going to be speaking about next. And it's something that we talked about a lot for many years in this country and other countries. Often the same way we talk about the weather, we watch it get worse, but we don't really know what to do about it. And the pandemic has perhaps created a fresh opportunity and a challenge. Governments usually become re-legitimized in times of crisis. At the same time, the expectations of citizens change, and they are more attuned to the basic issues of competence. They expect competence. Demonstrating that is a precondition for renewing trust, just as trust is a necessary codependent for acting with competence. So how do we seize this moment and the greater expectations that have come with this moment for the long-term good? I am very pleased this evening to welcome our keynote speaker, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations, the Honorable Bob Rae. He is one of the most thoughtful people in Canadian life over, well, more decades now than he would care to admit. And I've observed him for most of his career. So more decades perhaps than I care to admit, although I've been in the safe space of galleries and appreciate and admire his wisdom and candor. So Bob Rae will speak about public trust and the pandemic for 15 to 20 minutes, and we will then welcome Politico's executive editor, Canadian journalist Luiza Savage, to probe the subject further in a fireside chat with Ambassador Rae. Luiza will give voice to your questions too. For those of you participating this evening through Zoom, please add your questions and comments in the chat box, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as we can. So I think that's, I was going to say without further ado, but I think that was a lot of ado. So I turn to Ambassador Rae. The floor as it is yours.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's good to be with everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you this evening. Many people who've watched me will be surprised that I've actually written out something, but I'm not going to read it word for word, but it will be a guide to what I have to say. This is a subject that's actually been of interest to me for quite some time. I can remember as a student at Oxford, where part of my interest was in industrial relations and labor relations, and there was a lot of talk about how Britain was a low trust society and how what was wrong with British labor relations at that time, and it was a period of significant conflict in the late 60s and early 70s, was that it was a low trust environment. So people began talking more and more about trust, which was actually not something I'd thought a great deal about, but perhaps I just assumed it was out there. But it's not. It's something that has to be built. It's something that has to be earned, and we have to come to grips with the fact that the absence of it creates tremendous problems. It obviously, most fundamentally in our personal lives, we know that when we lie to other people, or when we don't do what we say we're going to do, or when we betray a trust, we know that it's very hard to regain. But what is true at the personal level is also true at the broader public level. And I think I don't think there's ever been a time when perfect trust was throughout the land or was established in communities. But I think the important part and the important thing to think about is, why is it such a significant problem today? But also to stress there are things we can actually do about this. It's not irremediable. There are ways in which we can create, if we have the political will, greater trust in not only in terms of our own lives, but also greater trust in terms of how our society functions. It'll be obvious to everyone who followed my life in any way, shape, or form, that I don't speak from a position of perfection. In my time in politics, for example, I have changed my mind, I have broken promises, and I have changed political parties. People would say, well, how can we possibly trust you if you do that? And I know there are many people who do take that position, but I've always tried my best to be candid about my mistakes, about my changes of mind, and I continue to believe that it's better for a political leader to break a promise that's based on the wrong premises, rather than to keep a promise that one knows is unfounded in evidence or anything resembling good public policy. I've also pointed out that the standards that apply to our personal lives also apply to our public lives. And to quote Leonard Cohen, this means that there are no perfect offerings. Contrition and forgiveness allow us to go forward in our personal lives, and that should apply to politics as well, but it's hard to do. I was friends for many years with a French politician by the name of Edgar Pisani, for whom I had enormous respect and regard. And we struck up a friendship when he was well into his 80s, and I was just leaving politics for the first time. And he came to Canada to live for a while, and he was a great mediator and a very thoughtful person. And he would say when he died, we had being very French, we had a colloque for Edgar. We had a meeting that we'd talk about him, and we all agreed at the end that we kept careful notes. And the person who was reporting on the colloque said that we've developed something called the Passani Protocol. What is the Passani Protocol? First is listen more than you talk. Now, this is very hard for me to do. As many of you who know me will know, that it's not my greatest quality, but nevertheless, it's one that I think is worthy of trying to embrace. The second is to start every sentence in a conversation or in a discussion or a debate with the thought that you could be wrong. You might even say it explicitly. You might say, I could be wrong, but this is what I think. Because that creates a sense of openness and tentativeness to what you're proposing that allows the other person into the conversation. And the third is to create the space, to create space in what you do, in any mediation that you're involved in, or in any other kind of discussion or political conversation or parliamentary conversation, to create the space where you can do these two things, listen and admit the possibility that you're wrong. Now, this might seem incredibly simplistic, but actually imagine for a moment if Parliament was like that. Imagine if people actually listened to what other people said. And then imagine if they started sentences by saying, I could be wrong. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe you can persuade me in some other way that I could be right. And imagine if Parliament was a place where we created the space for that kind of a dialogue to take place. I think the trouble we're facing today is that there are very few places, whether it's a board meeting, whether it's a political meeting, whether it's any decision-making process that you can imagine, a community meeting of any kind, where people start from the premise that they're going to listen more than they talk, and most importantly, admit the possibility that they could be wrong. Sometimes people think that admitting the possibility that you could be wrong is in fact a fatal sign of weakness, that it doesn't show strength. And I've written previously in the latest book that I wrote, What's Happened to Politics, about the difficulty of establishing something one could call political discourse or conversation that allows people to actually listen to each other and to come to conclusions and then to see things in a slightly different way. I think we have to recognize too that it's not just, if you like, the world of communications and of the media or the ways in which we talk to each other that's creating the problem. I think the problem is actually even deeper than that. And I think there are three great factors that we can experience today that, and there are many others, but I would mention just three. Maybe as I'm talking, I'll think maybe four that I think we need to think about. The first one is the unhinging, the uncoupling of economic prosperity from economic sharing. This is not a recent phenomenon. It's not just a matter of one government or two. It's not a Canadian phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. And I think it's partly caused by the power of technology and the speed with which technological revolution can establish enormous opportunities for wealth. Just anecdotally, many of you may have noticed, perhaps some of you may even have shares, Tesla made $36 billion in increased valuation yesterday in one day, one single day, largely as a result of a single purchase by a company that had previously been bankrupt, Hertz. Well, you know, this is not this is more like a casino than it is like reward for work. Yeah, of course, there's all kinds of technological factors have meant that Tesla is more exciting than it might have been before. But for somebody who's worked a really long time all their life and suddenly loses their job, finds themselves in facing great difficulty, and they see this happening, it becomes bewildering and creates enormous frustration and enormous anger, and frankly, a lack of trust in the system. President Kennedy used to talk about the fact that, the rising tide would lift all boats. And that was his justification for the tax cut that he introduced in the early 1960s. I think we know that that's not true today. The rising tide does not lift all boats. It lifts some boats. Perhaps it lifts a few yachts, but it doesn't lift all boats. And at the same time, the programs that we constructed at the end of the Second World War, which were intended to ensure that the Great Depression would never happen again, and produced an unprecedented period of prosperity, not only in Canada, but in many different countries in the world for well over 25, 30 years. That's come uncoupled. So this uncoupling of prosperity and the sharing of prosperity, I think is a hugely significant problem in the nature of disruption today. More recently, of course, we're right now dealing with three other great crises. One is the impact of COVID, the pandemic, which is called a leveler, quite wrongly. It's a magnifier, it's a revealer. It's created, I think, great difficulty for people in trusting institutions to find solutions. I think I see this globally. I was very interested in Tracy's account because I think what she described is the way in which you do public policy right. And as Ed said, you can do this if you have adequate supply of the vaccine, if you have the ability to get it distributed in an effective way. But in the world today, the situation is much more chaotic. So from where I sit in the UN, I have to say the environment is becoming one of less trust than more trust. Less trust because countries see some countries vaccinating themselves quite effectively, but not vaccinating anybody else. And that is, I think, creating enormous hardship. I think it's not just a health issue, it's becoming an economic issue as well. When we see the differential economic impacts of COVID, we're beginning to understand that it threatens the underlying conditions that create for greater trust. The second great factor, of course, is climate change, which we denied for a long time. It's important to remember that our governments have been signing climate change treaties since the mid-90s. They've been signing them, but they haven't been doing much about it. Europe's gone ahead in terms of its ability to kind of really try to implement the social and economic changes that will make it possible for reasonable lives to be lived after 2050 or 2060 or 2040 or whenever it is that the impacts become even greater and stronger than they currently are. But there's no question that climate change is an enormous disruptor. And coupled with the impact of technological change, it is, I think, going to create even more disruption. And that disruption in itself creates a climate where people don't believe what people tell them. They don't accept authority the way in which authority was accepted before. I can remember asking my friend Eddie Goodman, who was one of my mentors in life, a staunch conservative. And I asked Eddie once, I said, what's the difference between practicing law when you started practicing law with your father in the mid-1940s, late 40s after the war was over, and what's like practicing law today? And he said, oh, that's easy. He said, when people would come in to see my father for legal advice, he'd give them the advice and they'd say, thank you. They took it and they'd do it. Even if they didn't like it, they'd say, okay, the lawyer says I have to do this and I respect them. So this is what's going to happen. Now, if somebody comes in for legal advice, they don't like it, they go somewhere else. They say, well, I don't want to do what you want to do. I'm not prepared to accept. I don't concede to you the authority which I trust or which I want. And I've got enough means to go out and find somebody else and do what I want. And I think you talk to doctors, they'll say the same thing. People will often head into the doctor's office today armed with reams of paper from the internet, where they've already diagnosed themselves. They already know what's wrong with them, and they already know what treatment is required. Often they're wrong. Often it's not the case, not what's there. But the point being that when you have this many points of authority or points of information, it creates a decline in trust and a decline in willingness to engage in a more serious way. And I think this additional factor of artificial intelligence and the digital revolution and the expansion and explosion of social media is creating further declines in trust. If you compare, for example, the acceptance, which in the 1950s, everyone accepted the polio vaccine and said, fine, it's a risk. The doctors say I should take the vaccine. I'm taking the vaccine. That's not true today. I was having a dinner last night with the ambassador from Jamaica. And I said, how's the COVID situation in Jamaica? And he said, well, we're pissed off with you, for starters, because you're doing much better than we are. And you didn't give us enough of your vaccine, which is a totally understandable thing for him to say. And he said, but our other problem, frankly, is we now have some supply, but we only have 12% take up. So the campaign that's going to be required to get people to take the vaccine is hugely significant. Now, in many parts of the world, there is not sufficient supply, but in many other parts of the world, there is, and you have vaccine resistance. We see it here in the United States. I'm speaking to you from New York, and we see it here. It's reported on the news every night, and we can see it. So I think I think it's fair to say that with this great dispersal of authority, with this dispersal of income, and with this really terrible deterioration in public discourse, that the social media has contributed to, but it's not the only factor. We're facing I would say, a crisis of trust, where it's really difficult to find ways to move on and to get a greater and stronger sense of how things have to be done together. We see it in our politics. We see it in the division between in the last election. We certainly saw it. We see it in federal provincial rivalries, which are not new. We often see it in failures to really communicate and trust between business and government, or between the civil society and government. It's difficult. It's difficult to establish something which is in short quantity, and it's difficult to do it in a world that's extremely complex. But it's not good enough just to explain or to complain. I found one of the most refreshing things about moving from opposition to government, and then getting out of politics from time to time, sometimes willingly, sometimes not so willingly, is that you realize this basic truth that it's much better to be a positive person than to be negative about everything, because it doesn't help. And I think we have to reassert our commitment to certain virtues at a personal level, and also at a broader level. The first one is that we thought, I think, that with the scientific revolutions and the growth of rationalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, that the war for science, that the arguments about scientific evidence, about facts, about what's likely to be true, about effective understanding of how statistics work and how probabilities work, we thought that was over. We thought that was kind of done, but it's not done. It's a war we have to fight every day, and it's a very compelling. If you go on social media, you'll see all kinds of crazy theories or crazy ideas given equal status to much more authoritative evidence than people are prepared to accept. So we really need to understand the importance of this in the most profound ways. And I think it's really useful for us to remind ourselves that democracy itself depends on these things. That it depends on a climate of truth telling and an insistence on facts and telling the truth and resisting propaganda in every way we possibly, detecting propaganda and resisting it whenever we can. I spent a great deal of my time at the UN just having these arguments with people about, well, what somebody just says, well, you know, it's the same thing when you put Madame Meng in house arrest. It's the same arbitrary detention as when we put 2 of your citizens in our jail. And you say, no, it's not the same thing. That's not true. You're not telling the truth. And frequently this becomes a matter of some controversy. My goodness, are you calling someone a liar? You say, well, actually, truth is not being told in a great many places. So we need to resist. We need to resist it, and we need to understand that lying has never been a good thing, but it's extremely widespread. And we need to have the courage to call it out in every way. It's also true to say that I think we need to move beyond. We need to understand that we're living in the equivalent of the Gilded Age and perhaps the Great Depression. We need to understand, this is the old social democrat in me talking again, is the value of solidarity. The very important value of solidarity in breaking down mistrust and in breaking down a lack of confidence that people have in institutions. Institutions have to be responsive. They have to be able to generate and help to generate more prosperity. We expect the market to do that. We expect the market to produce innovation. We want the private sector to perform in that way. But we also I think people want their governments to respond with solidarity to people who are homeless, to people who have no income, to people who have no opportunity, to people who are lacking access to health and to education. Finally, the final point I want to make is that, and this obviously is a reflection of my life here in New York, is these problems are not national or local. We can't afford to be narrow in our assessments of what's going on. We have to understand that, you know, there is no national solution to climate change. There is no national solution to COVID-19. And frankly, there are no only national regulations that are going to allow us to deal with the impact of social media and the impact of the digital revolution and the impact of artificial intelligence. These things are going to require not only a national approach, they certainly require a national approach as well as a local approach, but it has to go beyond that to include the whole country, the whole world. We've learned that the effects of secondhand smoke cannot be contained by having smoking sections in restaurants and in airplanes. We don't do that anymore. We used to, but we don't. Well, we still have a lot of smoking sections out there globally. We still seem to somehow think that we can, that the answers to climate change and the answers to COVID are only going to be national answers. One of the challenges of the politics of the last year is it's made people look much more to their local government to solve their problem. Canadian citizens look to the Canadian government and to their provinces and to their cities to respond effectively to the crisis that was facing them. And that's good, but it's not good if it means that we care less about what's happening in other places, or that we say, well, that's their problem. They're going to have to solve that. We can't solve that. But the reality is that we have to find ways of sharing the solutions and sharing some of the answers and working to create stronger global solidarity in response to these crises. These are things that are not just nice to do; they're actually necessary to do. As I said, we're not going to deal with climate change until we find global answers, and we're not going to be able to find the answers to the pandemic unless we effectively not only impose solutions on ourselves, but deal with them more creatively and more broadly. So, if I could just conclude by saying that one of my sort of mantras has been a quote from a poem by Doug Lapin, who was a great Canadian public servant, an economist, as well as a poet and a novelist. And at the end of a great poem that he wrote about Frank Pickersgill and Jim McAllister, who were two brave young Canadians who were killed in France towards the end of the Second World War, very tragically captured by the Germans and killed in Buchenwald. And he wrote a long poem about them, which is a very moving poem. And he wrote these words at the end. He said, without a core of courage, how can anything be built? And courage shadowed by weakness may be the most precious of all, since it carries sweetness into the heart of the building. It carries it like honey into the hollows of the honeycomb. I don't think there's ever been a time when we needed more leadership, more candor, more courage, more sort of joint determination to reestablish this very simple value called trust. The confidence we have in one another, the confidence we have in our ability to solve problems, to get to the bottom of things, and to provide solutions to critical issues that actually do have some answers. But we have to have the courage to find them, and then the courage to do something about them. That's not just true for our cities, for our provinces, for our countries, for our businesses, for our institutions, wherever we may be working. It's true for the world. And as I keep saying to people, the key, I think, for understanding what our target has to be is we have to learn how to become just as much at home in the world as we are at home in our family, as we are at home wherever we're living. And with those words, I'll look forward to any comments or questions, anything you want to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Ed, and thank you to the Public Policy Forum. I'm Luiza Savage. I'm joining you here from Politico's newsroom just outside Washington, D.C., where we would absolutely agree there's been an absolute crisis of trust in our politics. But I'd like to pull back the lens a little bit. We've been asked to talk about public trust from a global perspective. So I'd like to get your thoughts on, first of all, the big picture, which is trust in democracy. Here in the United States, with the 2020 election, there was such distrust among so many people in the outcome of that election that there was actually an insurrection, a violent swarming of the Capitol that led to the deaths of 5 people just a few miles from where I'm sitting. But it's not just in the United States. Polling from the Pew Research Center shows that trust in democracy worldwide is on a razor's edge, with just over half of people saying they are not satisfied with how democracy is working in their country. Now, Canada's an exception. About 3/4 of Canadians are pretty happy with their democracy. But this isn't just an academic question, because as you know, Ambassador, when you look around the world, there is a rival to democracy, and that is the authoritarian, quote unquote, capitalist model of China, which is a well-financed, high growth, good results for their people model. And the Edelman Global Trust Barometer, which does a lot of in-depth research on public trust, shows that China is more trusted than America across the world, although that trust has dropped in the wake of the pandemic. So I guess my first question for you is, as you make the rounds of your colleagues at the United Nations, behind closed doors, where do you see more trust? In America and the democratic West, or in China right now?
I think it's definitely a contest. I think it's fair to say that here in New York and at the UN, there is a palpable sense of there being I guess you call it a kind of a battlefield where our institutions are being challenged, where our ability to deliver is being challenged, and where people look at examples of democracy in different parts of the world and have questions about it and questions about its effectiveness or how well it's working. I'm not prepared to say that I don't believe that all is lost. I don't believe that at all. And I think we have to be far more effective than we've been in not only in delivering on the promise of democracy, which is the basis of the United Nations was the promise of democracy. we formed the United Nations after the Second World War because we believed in the rule of law and we believed in the principles of the Charter. But it's been a struggle to deal with. I mean, first of all, with dictatorships, with propaganda, with lying machines and inconsistencies in all of our part, and frankly, because of this absence of what I call solidarity, which I think is more and more necessary today for us to be able to deliver on what we have to do.
Mhm.
So, I mean, the warning I think we have to give to the world is to say, if we don't show a combination of compassion and competence in our institutions and demonstrate that they are more effective than the alternative, then the alternative will do better.
Mhm.
But I think we also need to understand that the trouble with the alternative is that it's based on oppression. It's based on an absence of freedom, and it's based on political authoritarianism. And that I think is not something that is going to have lasting appeal. I think what we have to demonstrate is not just that, you know, the power of our example, but we also have to demonstrate that we are willing to share and we are willing to engage in ways that I think, frankly, many countries have been reluctant to do as effectively as they need to.
Mhm. But from Canada's perspective, everything that you said, the authoritarianism, abuses of human rights, the absence of rule of law, yet the two Michaels have been released, and now there is a question facing many Canadians. Is this perhaps opening the door, if not to more trust with China, then perhaps renewed business relations with Beijing? Do you think that is the way to go? And when do you think we'll see the long-awaited China policy from the Trudeau government?
Well, I mean, I think the relationship with China is complex. And I think it's not just Canada's relationship. I mean, one of the ironies is that there are many, many countries around the world that may be critical of China in a variety of ways, but everybody's trading with China. I mean, everybody is trading with China, just as everybody's trading with the United States and frankly, with Canada. But China is a major economic power. And that, you know, in a very important way, that means that the issue of how we effectively deal with the situation with China is different than what we faced with the Soviet Union in the years after the Second World War. The rivalry with Soviet communism is very, very different from what we're facing today with the Chinese. It's very different. Sometimes there are simplistic comparisons made saying, you know, this is just another Cold War. You know, when you say to me, are you going to resume trade with China? We've never stopped trading with China. Neither has the United States. The economic activity between the United States and China was greater last year than at any time
So
in
what
history.
does the release of the two Michaels change then, from Canada's perspective?
I think, well, first of all, I think the policy, now the election is over, and now that we've seen, thank God, we've seen the release of the two Michaels. I think obviously the government of Canada will be, in addition to doing all the other things that governments do, I think it will be making clear what the direction of our policy on China is. But I would say the elements of that policy are already very clear. The first one is that we don't accept the Chinese definition of the rule of law as they've applied it in the case of the two Michaels. We don't agree with the way in which they are oppressing people in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong and in other parts. We are concerned about the growth of nationalistic ideas and expansionism, which we think is very risky to the security of Southeast Asia. We also believe that we won't find a successful, as I said in my talk, we won't find a successful solution to climate change unless the Chinese are deeply and heavily engaged. So it's not a simple question of, well, are they rivals or are there areas of partnership? Is there a competition as well as cooperation? The answer is there are all of these elements involved, but our self-interest requires us to continue with an approach that says we will engage, but we will not engage on any terms, and we will not be buffaloed into silence because we believe that we have to be able to express the concerns that we have, as we've done with respect to Xinjiang and as we've done with respect to Hong Kong. And then the question becomes, well, what else can you do? And I think that's something that Canada can't do alone. It's going to require an unprecedented degree of cooperation with other countries to achieve that. And I think Canada will play its role in that
What advice do you have
challenging
then?
environment.
What advice do you have then for the new foreign minister? Today was cabinet day. Minister Jolie, as she takes on the portfolio and seeks to build trust on the world stage.
Well, I hate to be kind of, mealy-mouthed, but I'm going to be a little mealy-mouthed and say, I think the first advice that I should give to Melanie Jolie would be the advice that she asked me to give her, rather than do it by means of a Zoom call, where she's not directly participating. I think I owe her that as a public servant. And I think my other comments about the direction of our foreign policy are quite in keeping with what Minister Garneau was talking about when he came to the United Nations in September, and I'm looking forward very much to working with Melanie Jolie, and I'll certainly be sharing the text of my comments today as well as other things that I do, but she may well have some advice for me too.
Sure. So moving on to trust in government and the pandemic. I was fascinated to see in the Edelman Trust Barometer that in the first 6 months of the pandemic, trust in government in Canada skyrocketed by 20 points. And in the months that followed, it dropped back by about half of those gains. But government was the most trusted institution at the beginning of the pandemic in Canada and elsewhere. But since then, the same study shows that business is now more trusted than government in 18 out of 27 countries that were surveyed. Citizens now trust information from their employers more than from government leaders or elsewhere. So the pandemic was obviously a great example of public-private collaboration when it came to both creating and rolling out the vaccines. How can government take lessons from that collaboration for public-private partnerships going forward?
Well, first of all, I don't think anybody should be surprised that, it would only be the case that people's trust in government wouldn't have been increased if governments had done a terrible job in responding to the pandemic. And I think, without being partisan for a moment, I think one can say Canadian public institutions, for the most part, with some significant exceptions, which I won't comment on, responded well in difficult circumstances. And I think Canadians were prepared to, cut people a little bit of slack and say, well, we're not going to reach instant judgment, and I think that's good. That's a healthy sign, I think, and I think governments delivered, and not just governments delivered, but I think that, as you point out, the resolution to the pandemic was not just a government response. It was a response where there was unprecedented collaboration between labor and business, between the chambers of commerce and the federations of labor and many elements of civil society. And I think there was a period in which there was a great deal of cooperation and people really trying to figure out, how do we get through this? And frankly, federal government was prepared to sign the check, which really took a lot of the fear and the sense of panic out of the situation. The government said, no, don't panic. We're going to get through this. I think as time goes on, it becomes more difficult because people then revert to the normal and the usual rhetorical flourishes on all sides, and that we get back to greater misunderstanding and challenge. I think the key thing for relations between the business sector and government, above all, I think it's candor and honesty in expressing concerns and in responding to those concerns. I think it's based on building personal relationships, which are always extremely important in making sure that there's no misunderstanding, and also ensuring that both the public and private interests are served. One of the challenges with public-private partnerships as a major concept in public policy is is doing it right, is making sure that actually there is a guarantee of the public interest, as well as a respect for the fact that you may be able to build things more efficiently, you may be able to save money doing it. And when I was premier many decades ago, the 407 was the largest project going in North America at the time that it was being built, and it was built as a public-private partnership that withstood public scrutiny. Now, what happened to that afterwards was what another government decided to do when they decided to sell their interest in it. And I thought at the time that was a mistake, because I thought the public interest was not fully protected by that decision. But these are political decisions that are made from time to time. You have differences of opinion.
Provincial politics, we have an audience question from Montreal, I believe. Trust is needed internationally, but also within Canada, between provinces and federal governments. The pandemic highlighted that once again. Do you think we're making progress on that front, or where do we still need to improve?
Well, I mean, I think, to be honest, I think that in the opening phases, the federal government responded with a great deal of generosity that may have taken some people aback in terms of the willingness to move in a way that allowed us to keep the economy and keep people more whole than they would otherwise have been. As time goes on, there's a tendency in life for things to go back to, well, you're giving them more than you're giving me. You're not doing enough for this. You're doing more for him than you're doing for me. That's never healthy. And I think the more we can be clear about the facts of the situation, how much has been spent, how much has gone here, how much has gone there. And the more we can have, and it'll take another round of budgets, I think, to really reveal to all Canadians what exactly is the financial situation, what is the picture, and how can we resolve going forward, and how can we move forward together. That's what I think what's going to require. But it's going to require an unprecedented degree of federal provincial cooperation going forward. And I have to say that I think, from everything I've heard and seen, I think the federal government is very, very aware of the need for that, but also of the challenges that exist in creating that level of trust and confidence.
So another piece of trust in government, obviously, is personal trust in leaders and among leaders. I have a question that was shared with me by our team in Ottawa, who are asking the Prime Minister has made a priority of reconciliation with Indigenous people, but reconciliation has to be based on trust. And most recently, on Canada's inaugural National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, he spent the day flying with his family for a post-campaign vacation. And some have said he has lost trust with many Indigenous leaders. Do you think this was an important error on the Prime Minister's part that will get in the way of his ambitions around reconciliation?
I think the Prime Minister's already apologized. So I think that speaks for itself. I think I said in my speech, and I wasn't referring to that specifically, I was referring more to my own errors in life and decisions that I've made. I think that admitting your mistakes and asking for forgiveness and then starting up again and continuing to do what we're doing. I mean, the federal government has done more than any government in the history of the country to try to improve the relationships between Indigenous people and everybody else. I don't think there's not a government, either provincial or federal, that can match the record of commitment and frankly the record of expenditure that has got us to this stage. But I think what's also happened at the same time is that the standards are now higher. The knowledge is higher. The truth part has come out more and more about the extent of discrimination and the extent of the challenge. And I think that's what's creating a much higher level of demand and expectation that is also a fact of life. It makes governing more challenging, but it also, I think, it means that governments have to meet a higher standard, and I think that's what we're everyone has come to expect, not just
And how do
federally,
you
but
meet that
also at the
higher
provincial level.
standard? I mean,
Sorry, I'm sorry, I couldn't, I was just talking when you were talking, I didn't hear you.
sorry. How do you meet that higher standard? I mean, you said apologizing is one thing, but I think in the current environment, it takes more, right? I mean, given where we are in history.
Well, the agenda is a challenging one. It's a long one. I mean, I do believe that the objective has to be a greater degree of respect for sovereignty and self-government. And every government, requires jurisdiction, and it requires a financial basis from which to be able to proceed in improving its ability to service and serve its people. I think we have a long way to go in that department. I think we've made substantial progress over the last 25 years. I think the evidence is clear in terms of not only court decisions, but also the implementation of those decisions, treaty negotiations, etc. But they're going to have to continue, and they're going to have to be even more comprehensive in getting to lasting solutions. And I do believe the government is committed to trying to do that. It's not an easy course to chart, and I think that's exactly what they're trying to do now.
Mhm. So we have one final question with our clock ticking down, and this is from Heather on PI. What is our responsibility to compassionately respond to economic and political refugees, of whom there are millions worldwide?
We have to do our part, and I think we are showing our willingness to engage in accepting people. We accept more per capita as immigrants and as refugees than most other countries in the world. But the thing you learn about compassion is there's no limit to it, right? You can't just say, I'm going to show you this much compassion. Compassion and generosity are essential values of being a human being. And we expect our governments to respond in that way. I think we also need to understand that most people who are refugees in the world today, there's somewhere between 70 and 100 million displaced people in the world, are actually living in neighboring countries to where the crisis is happening. In Bangladesh, in the case of the Rohingya refugees, most of them, more than a million of them, are in Bangladesh next door, living in very, very difficult circumstances. So sometimes people say, oh, we're being put upon. And you say, well, no, actually, we're not being put upon. The tragedy is being experienced by some of the poorest countries in the world. And what we have to find as a comprehensive policy is with other countries, is ways of sustaining the countries that are hosting refugees, providing people with education, and also continuing to be a country that understands that migration is not a bad thing. We wouldn't have the country we have today if it wasn't for migration and for the movement of people. And we have to continue to be a place where people can find opportunity and understand that taken as a whole, our country has benefited enormously and benefits today enormously from the arrival of new people in our midst. It's a huge plus for us as a country. It's one of Canada's greatest strengths.
And before I hand you off for the evening, I'm just curious on a personal level, can you share anything that you've personally done to build trust with someone at the UN in the course of what does that look like for you on a personal level?
I would say that the way in which we as a country, the way in which Canada, certainly I as a representative, have tried to respond to requests for assistance, for example, on Afghanistan recently. I've spent a lot of time at a personal level, and I don't say this, in a way that sort of sounds like I'm saying I'm better than anybody else, but a lot of time trying to figure out how can we as a country help? How can I help as an individual? How can I respond to these requests for help that have come? And how can I channel them effectively to people who can make the decisions that will, allow us to respond effectively? And I think there are a number of other missions that are doing the same thing. And the more we can respond positively and personally to these situations, I think the more credibility we have as a country, as a place that says, well, it says we're going to do this. Hey, they did it. They said they were going to take these people. They said they were going to figure out a way to help people, and they've been doing it. And I think that's really how you create trust and how you create confidence. And I've learned long ago, I mean, starting out in politics longer ago than Ed says longer than I said, I was first elected in 1978. So that's a while ago. But as soon as you get elected to Parliament, you realize that your word is your bond, that your reputation can be destroyed in a very short period of time, and that what you stand for is what you are, and there's no hiding from it. I mean, the reality of politics is that most of what you do is pretty public, so people see it, that's how I live. I mean, famous comment about Teddy Roosevelt about living in the arena. I've lived in the arena, for better or for worse, and I've got all the scars to show for it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your evening with us. So the fascinating conversation from the big picture to the small. And now I'd like to hand it off to Anna Yan, who's Executive Director of the PPF Academy, and she will host the next conversation.